is an associate professor at Michigan State University, Department of Psychology. His research focuses on how factors both inside and outside of people influence their approach to social relationships, and how relationships and people change over time across situations. His research projects have been funded by the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the Canadian Institute of Health Research. Dr. Chopik's work has resulted in more than 100 publications in healthcare journals, including Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, Journal of Marriage and Family, and Frontiers in Psychology. Dr. Chopik was a recipient of the Margaret M. and Paul V. Beltis Foundation Award in Behavioral and Social Gerontology, awarded by the Gerontological Society of America in 2020. He also received the State Young Scholars Award in 2019, and he was elected as a top 30 scientist under 30 by the Forbes magazine in 2016. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Chopik.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for coming today. Really like seeing all the friendly faces, and I should be around all afternoon if you want to keep talking. Today's talk is about optimism. And what a terrible start. We'll unplug it, then put it back in. Yeah. All right. I can get you. Oh, got it. There you go. I just had to click. And you all know what optimism is. It's the generalized expectation that the future is full of good stuff, right? And when someone says that they're optimistic, you kind of know more or less what they mean. The really interesting thing is, though, when you have any sort of idea of how optimists are portrayed, both in society and kind of just historical literature, they're usually portrayed in not a very healthy light. So Voltaire's Candide is a story like so many others where people start relatively naive about the world, optimistic, full of hope. A few quotes from this are, "We live in the best of all possible worlds. The world is your oyster, go get it." Unfortunately, that story is full of tragedy. So he starts out really hopeful of life, but then people get syphilis, they get massively injured. By the end of the book, it's not super inspiring. The message is maybe you should just tend to your own garden and not think too possibly about the future, just focus on what's in front of you. Character on the right is Pollyanna from a play / book / movie. So if you've ever heard someone described as Pollyanna-ish, it's usually not a compliment, but this story too, so Pollyanna employs the glad rule, where she kind of focuses on the silver lining of everything terrible that happens. Slowly but surely, she's turning the town from kind of a miserly, negative town to really, really happy and positive. And then she gets hit by a car and can't walk. So she's rewarded with her positivity by not being able to walk and reflecting on the fact that she lost mobility. So it has a happy ending. She goes to physical therapy and starts walking slowly and surely. But there's an alternative reading that Pollyanna might be the villain because she's obnoxiously positive about the book in the book. But both of these stories are meant to say something about the human spirit. Pollyanna is perhaps the more healthy version where people are resilient and can kind of counter everything, exceed everything that they're encountering. But you see examples all over. So in the biblical story of Job, it's often a story of patience, but it's also a story of optimism, where he's sort of encountered with all these afflictions, but slowly but surely through his faith in a higher power, he overcomes these obstacles. So naturally, a lot of the first things people ask is there something wrong with optimists, that they're thinking positively about the future? Do they have some sort of deficit where they're not thinking super clearly? Have they not lived in this world the last 5, 10 years like all of us have? And it's generally the case that they're just as cognitively skilled. There's very little research on IQ, but it seems like they're just as smart as other people. But for today, the definition of optimism I want you to take away is that you are attentive to the positive things in life, and then you expect more of those things than bad things moving forward. So as long as you kind of get that general gist, you should be okay during this talk. One thing is I wanted to tell you about how optimism is usually measured. So today I'm going to be talking about how it's measured as a disposition. So what happens is people will respond to Likert type scales where I say, in uncertain times, I expect the best. But there's all sorts of different ways to measure optimism. So For example, economists might measure it in terms of whether or not there will be a dividend for a stock in the future, how it will perform. Some gerontologists basically ask, how long do you think you'll live? And your answer is an index of optimism. So if you think you'll live a long time, you're optimistic. If you think you'll die tomorrow, that's generally pessimistic. There's also a field of unrealistic optimism. And what they do is they say, imagine that you're a smoker. They'll say, what is your risk of developing lung cancer? And then there's public health professionals can actually operationalize that in a certain way based on like your family history, how much you smoke, various other risk factors. And they'll basically subtract those two numbers and they'll say, that's how unrealistically optimistic you are about, say, getting lung cancer. There's other things too, like they'll say, how do you think you'll do on a test next week or your qualifying exam? And then they'll see how poorly you performed. And again, they'll subtract those numbers and that's how delusional or unrealistically optimistic you are. And then finally, there are some kind of optimism within specific domains. Some of it's like, how do you think your love life is going? There's relationship-specific optimism, which Lisa has done some work on. How do you think this relationship is going versus like, is there going to be a meteorite falling tomorrow? So that kind of two different things. So I'm going to just talk about dispositional optimism, which historically has been linked to a lot of really great things. So for one, it's linked to educational and occupational success. So optimists tend to have higher GPAs and they're more likely to finish college. There was a study a long time ago suggesting that the more optimistic politician is more likely to win elections, although they should maybe redo that. They're also really good at performing under pressure. They are more likely to get a job at higher salaries, get promoted faster, and get raises. So that's the occupational success. And one thing that we'll talk about today is they also have better social relationships. So they report being happier. They report receiving more support, even if that's not true, which is something we'll talk about later as well. But in general, there's all these positive correlates of having that more dispositionally optimistic attitude. One thing that I wanted to focus on today, and one thing I try to focus on my work, is that optimists tend to live longer. And there's a few other correlates as well. So if you measure them at one point in time and then follow them over 40 years, they tend to report better self-rated health and then lower mortality. They also don't go to the hospital as much. After they get surgery, there's fewer complications, like stitches reopening or needing to go back for additional surgeries. They take fewer sick days, presumably because they don't get sick as much. They're less likely to have a stroke, less likely to have a heart attack. They have better pulmonary functioning, so their lungs are stronger. There's this test where you blow and try to keep a ball elevated. Optimists are better at that sometimes. They report less pain. And then one thing particularly for older adults is that they have better recoveries after they fall. So falls, especially when you're older, are this massive consequential thing that happens. Optimists recover better. So it's not like they have magical powers. Optimists tend to be doing healthier things. So they're more physically active. They're less likely to smoke. So there's some recent studies on vaccine education and kind of just knowledge about side effects of various drugs, what to do when you're sick with various ailments. Optimists know that. They eat healthier diets, often Mediterranean type diets. They set achievable goals, which is something that not a lot of people know about. They kind of know when to give up and pursue different goals if they're kind of frustrated. So it's not like optimists just pursue something kind of unencumbered. And the really fascinating thing is why I like studying optimism is that they think good things will happen in the future, and doggone it, a bunch of good things happen in the future. So it's always this really fascinating thing where people who expect positive things tend to accumulate positive things. And one of the explanations is that people think they have control over the environment. So if I think that good things are happening in the future, I can go make that happen. And that's something that is crucial. It's also called perceived mastery, control, locus of control. There's a few different names for that. But today's talk is a question about whether or not this is always a good thing. So there's tons of ways you can imagine that having an optimistic outlook might be detrimental. It might be embarrassing if you think, oh, I'll ask that really attractive person out on a date, even though they're way out of my league, and everyone will laugh at me when they say no. Oh, I'll approach my boss for that job. Oh, I'll take this risky thing. I'll try to jump over the Grand Canyon on a motorcycle. There's all these things that optimists might believe that could be really detrimental to their health and well-being. So another thing I try to do in my research is to acknowledge that a lot of psychological stuff about us isn't static. So it changes over time across situations. So one thing that I wanted to tell you a little bit about is how optimism changes across life and across age. And this is sort of relevant to the story of Candide and Pollyanna and Job. As you go through life, even think of your own lives, you encounter all sorts of things that might either make you more optimistic, like a bunch of good things happen, or a bunch of really objectively terrible things happen to you or your loved ones. And you might follow the story of Candide, where you kind of get more pessimistic as stuff happens to you. So what we try to do is make a few different predictions, and a lot of this will seem familiar to this group. So there's a few different reasons why optimism might change. One is that you just stink at fewer things as you get older. And this is one of the amazing things about getting older. You get better at your job, you navigate social relationships and friendships better. Imagine back to when you were like an adolescent and you were trying to figure out maybe where to go to college or start dating for the first time. Experience is a good thing that makes you maybe more competent. And that's related to self-determination theory. There's a few different core goals that people have. One is competence, like you just get better at stuff. So you might expect more positive things to happen if you kind of get more confident at life. There's also one that's probably really familiar to this group, socio-emotional selectivity theory. And very superficially, it's the idea that early in life, you tend to value things like getting ahead in life, status-related goals, seeking out information. But then slowly but surely, you realize that life is relatively short and that you might invest in things that prioritize your emotional well-being. That's seen in a lot of different things. When you ask people to reflect on their mood, their life satisfaction tends to increase over time.
Sorry, your camera's not on.
No, you're great. And here's a rough schematic that I'm guessing what's familiar to a lot of people, the idea that kind of early in life, there's this prioritization of getting ahead, information-related goals. And then over time, kind of that shrinking horizon happens and people start to kind of accumulate and shift their goals to more emotional levels. So what we tried to do is just very, very basically make some kind of just cross-sectional examination of how optimism might differ, say, among younger, older, and middle-aged adults. So for this particular sample, we had over 4.5 million people register at an online website where they got information about their personalities. And the really cool thing is this was from a company called the VIA Institute. And what they did is they translated an optimism measure into 44 different languages and then kind of let people all over the world take it for free. So we ended up getting people from 88 different countries that had at least 1,000 people in it. And what we tried to do is map kind of how optimism varies geographically, and then also how it might change or differ across the life. One thing that I won't talk a lot about today, but I'm sure tons of people are curious about, is that more industrialized countries and more kind of Western countries tend to say that they're more optimistic. And this is true of a lot of kind of emotionally balanced things where Western countries tend to give more intense ratings on scales like how happy you are, how joyful you are. Russia and kind of Eastern Europe tend to report being less optimistic, and we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. We zoom in on some more kind of proximal regions. But one thing we find is that optimism, if anything, is higher when you're older and the lowest when you're Candide's age, or if you're an adult. And this is at least somewhat consistent with that socio-emotional explanation. That maybe you're more attuned to positive stimuli, maybe you notice it more, maybe you expect them more. And as a result, that's kind of why we see this general increase of age. Maybe one of your questions is how this age trend might differ across countries, like if you're born in a relatively deprived country or just any country that's dramatically different than North America. And the answer is that it kind of doesn't. So there are mean differences between countries for sure, but across all these 88 countries, it looks like older adults tend to just be more optimistic. So one thing we tried to do, that was all cross-sectional, and it's interesting to track how people in different cultures age. But one thing is we wanted to just have a longitudinal study to give us a sense of how stable optimism is over time. So what we did is we were able to kind of dive into some historical samples of human development. These should maybe seem familiar to a few people. We measured optimism via what are called Q-sorts, and if you're under the age of 35, I'm happy to talk about what Q-sorts are, how they're distributed, the origin of the items. People know Q-sorts. I'm always Oh my God. Yeah, we got to talk later. They're so fun. They're so fun. So the really cool thing is I identified a bunch of different samples that included Q sorts in their development. So across the top here are the names of studies. So the middle three are the Berkeley Guidance, Berkeley Growth, and Open Growth. So these are really famous Institute for Human Development Studies. Glenn Elder, a sociologist, wrote a book called Children of the Great Depression, and it's based on these samples. Block is Jack Block, a famous personality psychologist. Mills and Radcliffe are women's colleges samples started by Rebecca Helson and Abigail Stewart, respectively. And the years are actually the years that people were born. And along the left are the ages that we have them. Okay, and all the numbers in the blanks are the number of observations we have. So the really cool thing is that because these people were born in different years, you actually can test some really interesting things. So for example, the Oakland growth sample was born before the Great Depression started. So they were kind of in middle, late childhood by the time stock market crashed. However, so that in that sense, they were a little lucky development-wise. However, they were unlucky because they were just old enough to be drafted into World War II. However, the two Berkeley samples were born in the smack middle of the start of the Great Depression, and they just missed being drafted into World War II. And that's partially what the Glenn Elder book is about. It's kind of these people born during the Great Depression. The Block sample came of age when they were 20 to 30 during the technological revolution. The two women's samples were doing separate studies. They kind of came of age during women's empowerment, where women started going to work and being part of the workplace for the first time, or more representative at least. So what you can do is you can apply a variant of what's called an accelerated longitudinal design, where you can estimate how optimism changes by pooling the samples from, say, how optimistic someone is at age 7 to how optimistic they are at age 77. But then there's a cohort sequential design where some people are born in 1929, some people are born in 1969, and you kind of can check their trajectories of how they change differently over time. The cool thing is we actually have people at the same exact age, but born decades and decades apart. So you can actually compare, maybe is optimism higher or lower among certain cohorts. All of that is to say, across all these samples, all of them become more optimistic. There's some intercept differences between the studies. The studies are all in different colors, colors of the rainbow here. So it looks like longitudinally optimism tends to go up as well. So it looks like optimism might increase across lifespan, consistent with a few theories I told you about. However, it appears to kind of level off at ages. So I'm showing you those two graphs earlier again, and I kind of wanted to zoom in on that kind of late life area where it looks like optimism might be reaching a plateau or kind of flattening out a little bit. And actually, there's a whole host of theories that might explain why that's relevant. And this is where we start getting into the funny names that psychologists kind of come up with. One not so funny one is called terminal decline. And what these studies do is they actually take a longitudinal study and they wait for everybody in the sample to pass away. And then what they do is they say, what did you look like the 5 years just before you died? What does your well-being look like? And they'll often present graphs like this, where late into life, there is often this really precipitous drop that happens. There's also an accompanying social psychological theory called sobering up theory. And that's way out of Kendi, just you live your whole life full of positivity, but then you sober up to the fact that life is not all rainbows and sunshine. So one thing we try to do is to zoom in on that particular point in life to see what are the implications of those things for something like optimism. So what we did is we gathered data from the health and retirement study I worked on as a graduate student. And we essentially looked at how optimism changed over a 4-year time period for the data we got at the time. And then how much those changes in optimism were correlated with your health changes. So if you got sicker, did you become more pessimistic, essentially? And one really interesting thing with these type of data is that you can kind of pinpoint the exact age where people stop becoming more optimistic and start becoming more pessimistic. So in this particular sample, it's around the age of 69. And don't get me wrong, they're still very optimistic. It's not like they go from being Pollyanna to listening to grunge and wearing dark eyeshadow and chain wallets and My Chemical Romance. It's not that. They're all pretty positive still, but there's a sense in which they start to decline a little bit. This is the same information showed a different way. This is the slope. So if the number is positive, it means that the optimism is increasing, the people are increasing. If it's negative, it means that they're becoming more pessimistic. And you see that kind of inflection point around age 70. A really interesting thing happens down here, kind of after age 95, 96, where people become more optimistic. Our best guess is that's what's called a selection or survival effect, where if you survive past a certain age, you might just be psychologically different than people who are past it. So optimism increases about 68 to 70, depending on the exact analysis and sample. There are a lot of what are called individual differences, meaning just people increase and decrease at different rates. It was linked to people's health. So as people became more unhealthy, their optimism declined at a faster rate. So there's at least some calibration to your thoughts about the future based on your physical health or your older adult. And we did a bunch of moderation tests in terms of kind of race, ethnicity, educational groups, and it looks like optimism is generally a good thing across all those different groups. And we've seen that in a few different samples at this point. But why does optimism change over time? One thing, the one that I introduced, is that it might depend on stuff that happens to you, the really terrible things that happen to Pollyanna, or the really wonderful things that happen to you over the course of your life. This is consistent with a lot of research we've been trying to do where we see if people can maybe grow from adverse experiences. So we have a bunch of research on soldiers deploying and saying really terrible things. We have people getting divorced and bereaved, these really tough experiences. And this is such a downer talk. There's not a ton of evidence that people psychologically become, there's somebody at the door if someone wants to open it. There's not a ton of evidence that you become an amazing person after really terrible stuff happens to you. And I know that sounds super simple and something you could have guessed, but there are some psychologists who think that this is a really robust thing. So we did this with optimism. So we tracked 30,000 people from 3 different countries, and we measured a bunch of really terrible things that could happen to them. And across these 3 samples, we found that nothing reliably predicts them becoming more pessimistic. So the divorces, their partner dying, them getting diagnosed with cancer, their children passing away, them experiencing kind of negative health. Also happy stuff too, like getting married, having your first child, moving in with your partner for the first time. There really wasn't anything that we found across all the samples that was reliably associated with you expecting better things in your life. And this kind of gets back to that original idea I was telling you about, where there is a sense that optimists kind of see the world differently and perceive it differently. So a great deal of the literature is dedicated to how people make sense of terrible things that happen to them. It's called attributional theory. And a lot of that is centered around optimists, the fact that when terrible things happen to them, they think it's caused by everything except for them, and that those are external attributions. Whereas pessimists, even when good things happen to them, they don't think that originates from them. They think that that was kind of luck, or a happenstance, that I got married, the person said yes to a date, or that I got a promotion. Everybody else quit. That's why I got it. That's kind of the explanations that pessimists will give to things, and that's just different than how optimists make sense of things. So when something terrible happens, optimists might embrace kind of a fatalistic approach where it was sort of outside my control that this really terrible health thing happened. Whereas pessimists will kind of reflect, if I just drank Coke Zero instead of Diet Coke all those years, I could have avoided this thing. And these are the type of health attributions that pessimists tend to make. So again, it is at least partially in the way people perceive and explain things happening to them. It's also true of things like depression, self-esteem, all sorts of other psychological characteristics. So I wanted to close by telling you 2 places I think optimism comes from, and some data we have on that. One is geography, and one is your marriage. So I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about how optimism might cluster in different areas of the world and also the country. In this particular type of research, we try to get creative with the types of data we draw from. So for example, This is a map based on 181 million tweets. So what you can do is you can actually extract tweets that are geotagged, so we know where you live if you tweet. And you apply a word-based dictionary to those tweets based on the words optimists tend to use. And because Twitter is so active in the strong opinions they provide, that's the nice way of saying it. There's a lot of tweets that you can extract and measure people's psychological states from. So what kind of health psychologists will do is they'll create an index of optimism at the county level. That's what all these small spaces are. The white spaces are actually regions where not a lot of people live, and as a result, they don't really tweet a lot. But the more red and tense areas are the more optimistic places. And what health psychologists will do is that they'll correlate variation across counties with like the local rate of heart attack or childhood mortality, access to kind of preventative health services like vaccination rates and tons of other things. One thing you'll maybe see right away is that some of the more red places are where older adults tend to reside. So I told you the first 30 minutes that older adults are more optimistic than young adults. Think Florida, southwestern United States, Northeast. I live here, this yellow spot right here. We're I don't know, yeah, maybe we're getting better. I'm still getting used to Texas geography. Can you tell me where Austin is? Central. Right.
Down.
Right. Left. Oh, what you're saying? Oh, yeah. This? Yeah. So you're kind of on the higher range. Somewhat on the higher range. I will say that there's a bunch of different ways of operationalizing this. So the top left graph isn't tweets, it's actually survey responses from about 60,000 people. And psychologists have come up with a few different theories about kind of why people psychologically differ. One is what's called selective migration, the fact that people who are psychologically special move to a particular place. So bear with me, social psychologists have this theory that the frontier of the United States is special because back in the day, when people were settling Western United States or colonizing Western United States, the people who would kind of go on those journeys were more of the risk takers, more independent people. The institutions are often more independent. So the people who settle on the frontiers might be, more independent, optimistic about the future. Those optimists have children who are optimists, and those optimists have other children. And that's why Colorado might be super optimistic. That's just a theory. They have another theory about why people stay in a particular place. So there's sociodemographic explanations for that, right? You can't move if you don't have means. But they also say that being really neurotic or anxious is associated with not moving away from a place. And again, I'm not saying this. I just want to be clear. That's one explanation for why New Yorkers are so anxious is because none of them ever moved to a different place. And that's a terrible stereotype that I don't endorse, but it's a theory of social psychology. More interesting, to me at least, is how historical shocks and events happen and affect your outlook of life. So for example, this is data from GSOP. It's a 20-year, 30-year longitudinal study of people's well-being, and they have optimism from, I think, 2009 to 2014. And again, we know kind of the district of Germany that people live in. And one historical thing that we find is that East Germans, if they live east of the wall, tend to be more pessimistic than Western Germans. And the wall fell a long time ago, like 33 or 34 years ago. Gorbachev, for those that are kind of familiar with it, just passed away. Mr. Gorbachev teared down this wall. If you read historical books, which is what I'm spending part of my sabbatical doing, there's an explanation that when East Germans experienced the wall falling, there was kind of this rush of more service-related and technical jobs that they weren't entirely prepared for. So one reason why East Germans really struggled with the reunification is because they didn't kind of have those technical skills when they encountered this kind of brand new world that they weren't used to. And then that kind of inequality and inequities are kind of passed down through generations. And maybe that's one reason why East Germans might be a little bit more pessimistic. However, even in more homogenous countries, this is data from, I think, 20,000 people from SHARE, longitudinal study. You see that even in countries that you would think are a little bit similar, the aging experience of optimism is a bit different in all of them. There might be, levels that are kind of buoyed and relatively high throughout older adulthood, and then there's some that kind of decline really dramatically. And we have no idea why any of this is happening. So is there something special about, say, living in Sweden or Switzerland? Is there something about, say, the social safety net that might provide, a more positive and healthy aging experience? Maybe there's something we can deliver policy-wise that could say, hey, there's something about living in this particular country that they think the future isn't on fire. Something, that maybe we can do some interesting conceptual experiments where we kind of see what is contributing to people's well-being. These are those same German districts followed over time. And you see this graph looks terrible, and that's actually the point as to how terrible it is, because there's so many state level differences in how optimism changes over time. So there might be something about living in a particular region that has a better or more negative forecast. The same is true in the United States as well, where there are places that you think might be, better to live in or less, and as a result, you could think more positively or negatively about the future. So that's kind of what we're trying to get after, is explain variability and why optimism changes depending on where you live, where you're from, the local influences of your environment. But it's kind of hard. One thing is we think that context might affect optimism, and it might also affect the power of optimism. So if your environment is so kind of harsh, it doesn't quite matter if you're really optimistic. There's something about the environment that might, make even Pollyanna really depressed or unhealthy. So we're looking into those types of things. But I'm trying to end the talk on a positive note. So I wanted to talk about close relationships and how optimism might originate, at least partially, from the people around you. One cool thing is I don't have to explain a lot of this to, because so I'm usually in places where I have to explain that relationships are important, but thankfully. All right, raise your hand if you don't think. It's sort of this major source of well-being and meaning in people's lives. Friends and partners affect a variety of our health decisions and non-health decisions as well. So the main question for this back half of the talk is that, does the optimism, say, other people affect your health, and even if you become more optimistic over time? One cool thing is that I really love studying relationships is because they're so consequential. So there's been a few different meta-analyses like this. There's a whole Unstad, there's a Keith Laser one that shows that there are major consequences to having not only relationships, but good relationships. Oftentimes when you compare the risk of death to a lot of different traditional risk factors, oftentimes close relationships do explain a significant portion of variance, oftentimes larger than, say, smoking, drinking, getting vaccinated, physical activity, maintaining a healthy BMI. I will say all these things are kind of correlated too. So people in relationships tend to be a little bit more healthy on average. So this graph is a little deceptive in the sense that these all aren't independent. Marathon runners don't often smoke a lot. So there's a few kind of intercorrelations there. So what people will often study, at least in my world and kind of social personality world, is what's called the actor-partner interdependence model, which should also be familiar to a lot of you. It's the idea that there are what are called actor effects. So this is how my optimism might affect my health, and then partner effects, which are, you guessed it, what my partner's optimism might predict about me. So one thing we tried to do is measure if being married to someone who's optimistic was good for your health. And this came from the health and retirement study as well. And we found that indeed being married to someone who's optimistic was associated with better health. So both how healthy you say you were doing or how healthy you were, your chronic illnesses. So these things are like arthritis, diabetes, strokes, heart attacks. So you have fewer of those. Better mobility, so you exercise more. We've since done a study on cognitive decline where people married to optimists have better working memory. It's also true of individual optimism. So if you're an optimist, it's a good thing, but it's sort of this additional benefit being married to someone who is optimistic. Again, maybe it's optimists convincing themselves they're in good relationships, where they kind of don't use the word gaslight generously, but they somehow convince themselves, even in the absence of support, that they are the recipient of a bunch of good things. However, setting that aside, the actor-partner interdependence model often looks at how stuff at one static point in time predicts your health and happiness over time. However, I just wasted 40 minutes of your time telling you that optimism changes. So one immediate question is, should we be modeling stuff as time invariant, even though we know that it changes dramatically? And my answer would probably be no. Because it is generally the case that your relationships do change over time too. So I was reading this magazine and I came across a bunch of photos of people who tried to recreate the photos from their wedding day later in life. It's a very sweet picture outlet. So they tried to kind of replicate the pose. Miraculously, they often found the same clothes. By far, this is my favorite photo, just because I think his face kind of has this longing look of love and affection that it just, yeah, you see the years in the top left corner there, where even just decades and decades apart, you see that a lot of these people are still really love each other. But I show these at least partially to acknowledge that for sure you are married to the same person in the absolute sense, but there's a sense in which you and your partner share experiences, but then also have a ton of experiences that are separate. And the person you maybe married when you were a younger adult isn't necessarily the same person 30 and 40 years later, where maybe they psychologically changed in an important way. Of course, you shared tons of things. Perhaps you had kids, perhaps you bought a house together. But there's tons of things where maybe you go off and live an individual life for most of the day, and you're exposed to all sorts of different things that your partner's not. So one thing we tried to do is model a few of these different things. So the first two things I already showed you, where being married to an optimist is good for you. Changes in your optimism are associated with your health. As you got sicker, your optimism declined. So one thing we tried to do with this study is to see if changes experienced by one person had any sort of implications for their partner. So if your partner became more optimistic, was that a good or bad thing for you? Or did it not matter? So what we did is we waited a few years, and the Health and Retirement Study collected more data, more couples, and we modeled how these couple members, their optimism and their health kind of all correlated and changed together. One thing you maybe were curious about, that optimists tend to marry other optimists. The ICC, or the correlation, cross-partner correlation, is about 0.22 to 0.25. So it's not like a massive effect, but there is a sort of mating where optimists tend to marry other optimists. The same is true for pessimists. So a pessimist will often find another pessimist. We did some really fun cross-panel, cross-partner analyses where your optimism was pretty stable over a 4-year period. And it looked like, at least when we controlled for illnesses in this particular sample, part of the variance got sucked up from another cause. I'll tell you about in a second. So one thing is that if you start to model how optimism changes over time, you start to reproduce that kind of peak that happens when you're 70. I'll start to fill in partner influences in this figure in a second. Another cool thing we saw is that if your partner gets really sick, like if they get diagnosed with cancer, if they experience a really debilitating personal experience, it doesn't really affect your optimism that much. So, and we found that really interesting because part of thinking about the future is that you want to be with your partner and experience all the wonderful things together. And your partner getting sick would jeopardize that. But it looks like people are at least resilient to those types of things. What they're not resilient to is being paired with an optimist. So the effect is pretty small, but it looks like even over a 4-year period, if you are paired with an optimist, you tend to have higher optimism at time too. So this is kind of a contagion idea that we're trying to experiment with and look at now, where maybe optimism bleeds over and starts to affect other people in their life. Here's kind of filling in more with partners. And again, you start to see that solidified kind of peak that's happening. So at least part of the reason why you're optimistic has to do with the people you are maybe surrounding yourself with. In terms of future actions, things that we're trying to work on now is why being married to someone with a certain personality or optimism is good for your health. And this is an active partner model with a mediator. So for example, imagine that you have a partner who's really optimistic. Presumably they're doing things to motivate you to be healthier. Maybe they encourage you to eat healthier or go to the doctor or stop eating torchies and eat more salad, or Buc-ee's, or yeah, I'm listing all my favorite restaurants. There's something maybe about being married that might predict better health and well-being. And one thing is we want to isolate that mechanism so that maybe we can make people healthier. The challenge, though, is that there's a few different ways of modeling this, and this is kind of the difficult part. So on the figure on the left is more of a latent variable structural equation modeling framework where maybe your health is changing over time, and you can say, here's say an intercept of health and a slope of health, and then you can model those as kind of mediators of things. Another thing on the right, and I know a lot of HDFS people do kind of a multi-level modeling framework where maybe your previous day physical exercise predicts your kind of health the next day, and maybe optimism is kind of enhancing some of those effects or predicting kind of the onset of exercise. We actually got a grant by Wright. It's a really fun read. We're like, we're not exactly sure how to test this, so can you give us money? And we said yes. So it's kind of an interesting way if you get into this type of research where you can kind of just sometimes present methodological questions about like, what's the best way to model stuff so we have better answers moving forward. But to close, I just wanted to give a general acknowledgement that a lot of people talk about optimism and they're kind of agnostic about where it comes from. So there are certainly heritable estimates, but at least partially what I'm hoping you got for today's talk is that it might partially depend on your context, both where you live and the natural context and the built environment, but then also the people you surround yourself with. So the kind of question for today's talk was whether or not optimism was an asset or totally delusional, if you're totally kind of in denial about your life. And there is a sense when you look at, say, the attributional work, and then some of our work with life events where these generally devastating things that happen to people don't really change their outlook on life. So I pulled two quotes. I think one is a joke. I think this is a joke. But here's one from Kendi. What is optimism? It's the obstinacy of maintaining that everything's the best, even when it's the worst. And the optimist thinks that the best of all possible worlds, and the pessimist fears that this is also true. And it partially comes down to what you think about life, what you think about the future, and ultimately what you think about your environment. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That was amazing. And so we're going to open it up to questions, and we'd like the first couple questions to come from students in the room. So we have some here on the camera.
Sure.
Yes.
Chat box, which I can either read or you
I see.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Did it show a slight increase?
Sorry,
When you mentioned that illnesses don't
Oh, sure.
show the decrease, what happens? Is it stable? There's slight increase? What's going on there?
Yeah, so there's individual differences, right? But actually, when you look on average, it looks like they're not changing at all. And, and part of the challenge is because, maybe you'll have like 20% of the sample that gets worse, but then you'll have 20% of the sample that inexplicably gets better. And a lot of individual difference research is trying to figure out like why there's 20% of difference. So on average, it looks like it doesn't change at all. But then a lot of work is dedicated to say, okay, maybe if you're this particular kind of optimist, that's kind of what's good for you. And then this is the delusional part that makes you suffer after bad stuff happens. So the answer to your question is, it looks like on average it doesn't. But then the mystery is like, why is it good for some people and not others?
Great question. We have back in the room. Can you speak real loudly?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
No, you're good. No.
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
I guess maybe this is not like the focus of this research. I'm just curious, like, do they follow like people who are like pessimistic? Do they also get more pessimistic over time? Because I'm wondering if like you're saying it's the things that happen to them sort of like reinforce that it's more feeling will become more polarized over time.
Yeah, I mean, so pessimism is really interesting. So you tapped into a controversy in the literature where is optimism and pessimism the same thing? Or like, are they just two different types of people? Like one's Pollyanna and one is Eeyore, or whatever the equivalent is. So pessimists are pretty stable as well, just as much as optimists are. So, when good stuff happens to them, they don't improve. And when bad stuff happens to them, they don't even seem to get worse. So again, it has partially to do with confirmation and attribution. So when things go poorly for pessimists, that promotes stability actually, because they encountered something that went wrong and they were expecting that the whole time. The controversy emerges there was kind of a really huge effort where they reanalyzed a bunch of optimism work and they split up the optimism items from the pessimism items and said which was more predictive of like health and how long you live. And they found that it's all the pessimism items. So there's an alternative reading of this talk that like, it actually doesn't matter how optimistic you are, as long as you're not miserable about the future, you might be okay. And that's not as sexy a talk, and that didn't get you to come. But that taps into a controversy. I can tell you more about, there's some heritability work in terms of how people fill out those items, where maybe it's not pessimism, but kind of how we respond to response scales. That's like a kind of a more detailed thing we can talk about later. But yeah, so it's pretty stable, but it looks like pessimism might have more predictive power in terms of like outcomes in life. But that was just, it was a really controversial thing at the time, and still is.
No, that was really great. Yeah.
I'm gonna piggyback off of Ariel's question.
Okay, that's allowed.
When talking about how that can spill over into romantic relationships. So you talked about how optimism can spill over into your partner a little bit, at least. Do you know the work on pessimism to see if that spills over to partner and romantic relationships?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff we did was like just a unidimensional scale. So like you're pessimist at the bottom and optimist at the top. So a lot of the statements I made today are, if you just flipped around the language or the poll, it's generally true in terms of variation. So yeah, in general, we've done some work with framing, kind of like framing the future, which there's a person named Allison Ledgerwood who's tried to do this. Like you frame risk and protection in different ways, and that's supposed to shift people's mindsets. So say you framed it in a really pessimistic way. It looks like both of those kind of influence people, but people are really risk averse. They weigh positives, gains and losses differently, to say it a different way. And you see that with pessimism too. So that's from the economics literature, but you see that people might be more sensitive to negative stimuli. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that. Like more negative stimuli is way more costly if stuff goes wrong, rather than if you found $5 on the sidewalk versus lost $5. Yeah, there's a sense that it tends to bleed over among people, but they're perhaps more sensitive in some context to the negativity. And that just might be a human thing that extends beyond optimism and pessimism too.
Great questions. Let me just go to Sean.
Oh, yeah, I'm gonna have a perhaps similar question as
Okay. Sure.
So you mentioned that optimistic people are more likely to get a partner who's also optimistic.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if the effect of optimism is also kind of the effect of whether you and your partner match, like your value systems are matched. And then if both sides of the couple are like pessimistic, do they just get worse in terms of health outcomes, or they can also, because they share the same value system, so they can also figure out a way to manage the health outcome?
If we're spiraling and roommating together, is that a good thing? Ultimately, if we agree on that stuff. Yeah, that's interesting. So two things. So a lot of our lab looks at kind of similarity in those psychological characteristics and if that's good or bad thing. And this is another kind of controversy where online dating sites will often sell you on how compatible people are. And then relationships people will know a lot about this. It oftentimes doesn't predict how happy you are or if you stay together. And that's really non-intuitive for people, because when OkCupid, or not Tinder obviously, or Bumble, they don't do this as much, but when a website tells you you're 99% compatible with someone, you assume that, oh, we might have similar values and we're both religious or we have similar personalities. And it doesn't always translate to relationship success. One thing that we're finding a little bit is that dissimilarity might matter slightly more, and again, very, very slightly more for pessimists, where when things go wrong, the pessimism tends to be more influential in their happiness. So I also acknowledge that a lot of these things are kind of really intercorrelated. So when I ask people what they value, a lot of like positive values of things correlate with optimism just naturally. So if you say one, to start a family, you're at least somewhat optimistic about the future, right? Because a child will exist in the future. Investing in environmental causes. There's so many things that kind of optimism also taps into. pessimism as well. Pessimism predicts environmental charitable donations sometimes. So yeah, on the whole, it doesn't matter too much, but then there are some certain situations where pessimism might exacerbate the dissimilarities. But really, we've tried to slice it a million different ways, and it kind of doesn't matter too much. So that's my very superficial summary of all that. So.
Yeah, Nicole, do you want to?
So I know you said optimism was really big to health. I didn't miss it, but is there any literature on optimism multiple means like cognition, like memory or perception?
Yeah, so at least using HRS data, we find that optimists tend to have higher tick scores and working memory scores, and if you know who's the vice president right now, these are all cognitive tests people do. So there's been a few studies. There's been one that predicts like Alzheimer's and related dementia diagnosis, and it looks like your risk is lowered if you're optimistic. We've done one if you're married to an optimist that lowers your risk of those things. I will say more advanced forms of dementia and Alzheimer's, there hasn't been as much research on that specifically. And part of it has to do with optimism involves some degree of prospection about the future and identity and you being, say, a person in the future ongoing forward. And a lot of particularly related dementias, not necessarily Alzheimer's disease, do affect those types of things. I mean, there's a perspective on personality optimism that a lot of it's reducible to your memories of good things versus bad things. So yeah, in terms of really advanced forms of dementia, that I don't think that there's a ton of work on that, but the more normative rates, it looks like it's good for you.
Yes, this is, I have to say, students just ask phenomenal questions. I'm so glad.
They're too hard though. No questions.
I would say they're just so thoughtful and so great. Thank you. You guys just keep asking too, but I'm going to turn it over to Say now.
I think you briefly touched on this, but are there any evolutionary bases linking optimism and I'm asking you alluded to how people are more we are evolved to be more cognizant of negative feelings. Yeah. We have to be paying attention to risks and threats and so forth. Those are created to bring on these evolutionary.
Yeah, I don't want to fixate on all the negativity because optimism would also have an evolutionary explanation because you have to try kind of a variety of different things to maybe get ahead in life, find a romantic partner. There's some inherent optimism in thinking I want to date somebody because you think, oh, maybe this will work out, or let's get married, or let's have a child together. Those are somewhat optimistic statements that have evolutionary consequences, obviously, right? So there is a heritable component. So there's been twin studies. We actually did a twin study on how people change. Maybe how you change over time is attributable to kind of shared environment versus heritable forces, and there is. But there's a distinction. So something can be heritable, but we don't know the exact evolutionary mechanisms. I go back and forth because I think humans do have this negativity bias just because you avoid running into sharp things every day. That's something I try to do. But also there's kind of this calculated risk that people engage in, that they think things will work out. And the thing I found with optimism is that those aren't ludicrous kind of risks that people take. So oftentimes they're measured. Oftentimes when things go poorly, it doesn't devastate them, or they can kind of reframe it in a way that's not devastating. So yeah, it's really a sense of like which would pan out better. And I don't really know the answer because a lot of the work is based on attributions and health outcomes. It's not like, is this always good or bad thing for our modern environments? Yeah, and there's not really evolutionary people, not a lot of them really looking at some of this stuff, but yeah.
I'm saying, when I'm saying about the optimist influencing their partner and making them more optimistic, and therefore doing it on the pessimist or low and optimism idea of it, pessimism in general, pessimistic. And it made me think just generally when thinking about similarity in relationship partners, in our relationship partners changing us. Is there any evidence that they reach a stasis, right? Like, it's interesting too, because like if I'm an optimist, I'm making my partner more optimistic over time, like, unlikely I can continue.
Just go on indefinitely forever.
Right,
Yeah.
continue doing that forever, right? Like, it would make more, because also, if we think about it, they're having that influence on me simultaneously, right?
Yeah, so they might be dragging you more pessimistically.
Right,
Yeah.
so then we would presumably kind of get to the same place. Is there any evidence of that in the similarity literature that, or in that kind of like change? I'm not familiar with it,
Yeah.
but like that we kind of reach a stasis point with everything.
Yeah, it goes back to a conversation we had in a small meeting about like how people move towards similarity over time, like not a chessboard, but like different ways of operationalizing it. So as of right now, I don't know any literature like that. It's also just hard to measure it with other individual difference characteristics. I just don't think that like a lot of people have moved on from just measuring static similarity at one point in time. But in reality, like you'd think that people would grow to be more similar over time just because they share environments. Like you say, maybe they're dragging each other towards each other. I will say one thing we're trying to do is looking at it with subjective well-being, just because there's more data available. And we do find that the negative is more influential than the positive in that regard. So if you say one person is more optimistic and one person is more pessimist, who changes more? It looks like the happier, more optimistic person is dragged down quicker. So that's just subjective well-being. I will say we found it in like 5 studies at this point, over different ranges of longitudinal windows. But yeah, the stasis, and maybe it happens in the earlier years of marriage, and then it kind of reaches this kind of asymptote where we stop changing as much. But yeah, like I don't think people have done that sophisticated enough of a kind of modeling of it, but I don't know, it gels with my personal experience and kind of how I think about relationships. But the answer, I don't think the answer is no, I think.
Yeah, no, thanks for even, you know, a lot more about it than me.
No,
It's
no, no.
really interesting to hear what your thoughts on it are.
Okay, I have a question too, but I'll come back.
There's also one in the chat, but that's okay. Okay, but who was, you all showed up. Maybe we'll do, yeah. No, we'll stop. We'll do one on the, sorry, I didn't mean to insult everyone at home. Well, how about we do this one and then I'll do some in the chat? Does that sound good? That sounds fair. And then Karen and I can talk later.
We have.
I was wondering these studies had very diverse populations. I was wondering if they were trends, especially in the US.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So in terms of moderating how things change over time, it looks like they're mostly consistent. So there's no moderation in that sense, but there are mean differences or intercept differences, where more minoritized populations tend to report lower optimism. The differences isn't huge. The differences aren't huge. I will say there's a related literature on what's called John Henryism. Are you familiar with this at all? It's sort of a more historical construct where the idea is that you'll pursue a goal so much that it's physically exhausting, it will compromise your health. And actually we see, and that's sort of a form of optimism, although it's massively costly to the individual. It's associated with dying early and poor health outcomes. And a lot of times they'll look at populations of people of color, especially in upwardly mobile settings, if kind of they dramatically increase their socioeconomic status. And they find that those populations are higher in that. So that's somewhat related to optimism. But yeah, in general, we don't find a lot of differences and changes. We do find intercept differences there. But that's a literature that is somewhat related.
We'll turn it over to the chat.
Yeah, okay. Sorry for neglecting this. My friend Desmond asked the first question, so I feel like that's not fair. Desmond says, I have a question and maybe I missed if you mentioned any, but I think that all the studies presented were correlation longitudinal. Yes. Are there any studies that look into change optimism? Yeah, given all the positive benefits. So there are change studies, intervention studies. They closely resemble cognitive behavioral therapy, where you try to alter people's attributions and how they kind of view everything all negatively, all homogenously, that they'll never change. So there's a Penn resiliency program. That's what I think the paper is called. There hasn't been a lot of work on it just because it's really hard to change people's mindsets. So the answer is yes. I'm thinking cognitive behavioral therapy. I should have kept reading. Okay, so he thinks CBT. Yeah, so that's what that is about. Alexi says, do these optimism longitudinal studies control for self-esteem or extroversion? Similar to Desmond's question in regards to causality, controlling for theoretically related variables would make a stronger causal argument for the power of optimism. The answer is also yes, but there's not a ton of them. So what we'll try to do is we'll try to do propensity score matching, where we'll throw in a bunch of risk factors for the thing we're trying to look at. So for example, if we have a 70-year-old, there's a lot of things about that 70-year-old that might give them either a benefit or a disadvantage for how their optimism changes over time. But what we'll try to do is find another 70-year-old that has all those same risk factors, and we'll actually try to track those two people, and we'll say, okay, if we equated you on everything else, how does divorce affect your optimism? So we've been trying to do that more recently because causal inference is kind of this up and coming, or kind of has discovered this renaissance and reemergence, at least in our social personality corner. And that's been our solution, is to try to do some kind of matching of populations, although there's certain other things you can do as well. Manipulating mindsets is like another causal thing you could do. But historically, people have not done a ton of it, Alexi. So thank you for your question. Okay.
I think we have time for one more question. If somebody has one more. Yeah.
I wonder, in my mind, the optimistic seems to be very close to religiosity.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether you consider religiosity, and then how it is. Yeah, I just wonder.
Yeah, so there is a whole literature on that, and I find it really fascinating, especially, I mentioned Job, the story of Job early on, and the fascinating thing about religiosity too is that it intersects in interesting ways with optimism. It's correlated like 0.35 or 0.4 with optimism, so kind of pretty moderately. We're optimistic, where religious people are more optimistic. The interesting thing about causal or kind of attributions of the world is that religious people will often kind of alleviate their uncertainty by acknowledging that there's this higher power that controls parts of the universe or parts of their future. But the really interesting thing is that religious people are really high in personal mastery. So despite this acknowledgement that there's a lot of things out of my control, they're super active in making positive outcomes come about. And optimists are sort of like that too. Like, they think tons of things will be positive and work out, but then they're the ones actively engaging in the steps that bring about those outcomes. So yeah, I think about religiosity a lot because of that. It has to do with our attributions, why we make sense of the world. You know, if we think we'll behave in a certain way, good outcomes will come. So it dovetails really well with optimism in the sense that it's kind of this fascinating question about, why did things happen? What role did I have in them? And will things turn out okay in the future? And I think that's just really, really interesting. Thank you for that question.
I'm gonna begin to wrap up with just one personal thing, and it's really relevant, I promise, is that I had this cat who just arrived at my house. He's a stray cat, and it was like, just kept coming back, and you could hear it purring and things when I did things, and I named it Hopeful. And it was this incredibly optimistic cat. And the reason I say that is that on top of all of this brilliant research, Bill has done a huge study on cat personality. And he even has not scattergrams, he has pattergrams and little data points of cats. So on top of this brilliant talk, we're hoping we can bring you back again with your cat.
Should I have given that talk to him? Seems like people hate this and like that.
No, we're optimistic that your next talk will also be as interesting as this one. So let's thank him very much.
Great, thanks for coming, everybody.